Ready? Welcome to this Center for Process Studies seminar. I'm John Quiring, Program Director at the Center. Welcome to our online audience as well as our studio audience. Before I introduce our speaker, Dan Siakel, that's how you say your name, isn't it? Dan Siakel. We have a little ritual of self-introduction. So I just point to you and you say your name and where you're from. So we'll start right up here in the front. Your name and your...
Frank Hamilton, Ontario.
Welcome, welcome.
Pat Biting, Manhattan Beach.
Welcome.
Ignacio Castura, Claremont.
Welcome, way in the back.
Andrew Davis, I'm a student here at Claremont.
Welcome.
Michael Redding, also a student here.
Welcome.
John Cobb, Pilgrim Place.
Bill Mormon, Pilgrim Place.
Welcome. And here is Claremont School of Theology.
Steve Hilbert, CPS and CGU.
Welcome, Steve.
Leah Laird, CPS, and if you are inspired by this and would like to write a seminar summary for process perspectives, I would totally appreciate talking to you after the event. So take good notes.
Take good notes.
And it's also available online, so you'll be able to review it while you're writing.
Yes, sir.
Rich Procida, Whittier.
Welcome. Way in the back,
Andrew Schwartz, Center for Process Studies.
running our life-size machine.
Marissa Castillo from Irvine.
Welcome.
Jim McLaughlin from Cullowhee, North Carolina.
Welcome, Jim. And this is a plug for Jim. Jim will be speaking right here next Monday on a Mormon process theology. Jim McLaughlin. So our speaker today is Dan Siakel. He's a PhD candidate, teaching associate, and senior pedagogical fellow in the philosophy department at UC Irvine. There he received the Most Promising Future Faculty Member Fellowship. He's also a lecturer in the Chapman University Philosophy Department. Daniel Siakel received the Future Leaders Award by the Association of American Colleges and Universities. He has published in Process Studies, the Los Angeles Review of Books. He's presented papers on Whitehead's metaphysics at the American Philosophical Association meetings, and he received first prize in the International Process Network's Young Scholar Essay Competition. In his paper published in Process Studies titled The Dynamic Process of Being, a Person, Dan Siakel provided a novel interpretation of Whitehead's theory of personal identity. In his paper today, Siakel argues that process and reality contains conceptual resources to explain personal identity, moral responsibility, gratitude, and even the possibility of life after death. The experience of personal identity is an inescapable fact that in no way undermines holding ourselves and others morally responsible. So his title today is Reassessing Whitehead's Theory of Personal Identity, a New Interpretation and a Critical Examination. Will you please welcome Daniel R. Siakel?
So thank you, Mr. Quiring, for that introduction. Thank you also for making this occasion, so to speak, possible. I'd also like to thank Mr. Cobb for ongoing conversation about Whitehead, value, and other things, the university today especially. I presented a more technical version of this paper at the APA 2 weeks ago. Because everyone in the room is not familiar with Whitehead's metaphysics, this is pitched for a more general audience. And this makes me especially excited for the Q&A because it gives us a way to sort of test and challenge our intuitions about personal identity, illuminated or challenged as they may be by specifically Whitehead's theory, or actually I'm going to be arguing today distinct theories and in fact incompatible theories of personal identity. I believe there are two in his work. So everything that we discuss today is going to be premised upon the question, what is personal identity? So I want to sort of pump our intuitions about this to start out. In everyday discourse, we say that we are the same in certain respects. So there's a determinate sense in which I am the same person that I was a microsecond ago. There's also a sense in which I am identical to the person that I was when I was 5 years old. Also in everyday discourse, however, there's a sense in which I'm not the same person that I was when I was 5 years old. Thank God, right? We can become better people. We can become better over time. Now, we say these things in everyday discourse, and everyday discourse on its own doesn't give us the conceptual or philosophical resources that we need in order to explicate more precisely what personal identity is. Moreover, it doesn't give us the resources to explicate what a person is, such that it can, at least as we refer to it, remain one and the same over time. For that, we need philosophical discourse. Now, the ambiguity of everyday discourse on this issue of personal identity raises some fascinating and also important problems. Perhaps the first and foremost among them is, what reality does the phrase personal identity denote? What kind of entity is a person such that it can survive change, that it can sustain itself over time? And the ambiguity of everyday discourse also raises some skeptical questions about personal identity. That is, we talk about persons as if they remain one and the same over time. But is there a metaphysical reality that corresponds to our sense of personal identity? That is, are there persons, or are we under the illusion merely that there are persons? And if persons genuinely exist, conversely, what is their nature such that we can remain the same over time? What, in short, is the nature of our being? Now, any philosophical system, to be adequate, has to have some answer to this question. And I think personal identity is one of the foremost problems in the history of philosophy, precisely because, well, it's persons, or entities that believe we're persons who pose the question, but also one answers, the way in which we answer this question has systematic implication for one's philosophy as a whole. But the consequences of how we answer this question about personal identity don't just have philosophical consequences. They also have ethical, political, social, and cultural consequences and implications. The philosophical challenge concerning personal identity is to explain how it is that persons seem to be the same, in some sense, at different moments, but also different at different moments, and to provide a systematic account of that accords with the remainder of the philosophical system, a wider philosophical picture of the world, as it were. And to do that, as I've already indicated, that philosophical account, has to specify what kind of entity a person is, such that it can be both the same and different in whatever those senses turn out to be, according to that philosophy. Now again, questions concerning personal identity are essential not only for theoretical philosophy, in the clouds or ivory tower, as it were, but also practically. So for example, this might affect your moral position on abortion, or the possibility of life after death, whether socio-political entities are persons, like the famous one is, thanks to Mitt Romney, right, is corporations. Are corporations people? Medical ethics. When does a person cease to count as a person, and how does that constrain, or how should that structure our interactions with that entity? So it's both a fascinating and a serious issue, this issue of personal identity. Now today I want to focus more specifically on a project concerning Alfred North Whitehead's theory, or I'm going to claim theories of personal identity. But because Whitehead's theories are somewhat recondite, technical, and being process ontological, atypical, I'm going to begin by briefly introducing three generic approaches to personal identity from the history of philosophy, and this is going to help us situate Whitehead's contributions to the issue. Okay, so this is the first section, three generic approaches to personal identity. The first of these generic approaches takes personal identity to amount to or result from psychological continuity or connectedness, of some kind. Again, this is a generic view and it allows for all kinds of specifications. So you might think that the relevant psychological features or mental states concern memories, intentions, values, dispositions, and so on. And this will differ depending on the account. Most philosophers working in this tradition, Locke perhaps the most famous, takes these relations to be causal, and more specifically, causally efficacious specifically for personal identity. It's in virtue of memory having some sort of causal relationship with the past, in the present moment, for example, that makes me the same person on these psychological continuity views. Okay. Now, moreover, on such views, the substance or matter that supports the psychological features maintained by memories, intentions, dispositions, and so on, that matter or those substances can be different at different moments, right? So I presently remember the life-changing free jazz performance that I experienced in Chicago in 2004. Now, since 2004, every cell in my body and brain has changed. So the physical matter or the substances, what we might think are substances, underlying that experience are different on these views. But in virtue of my psychological connectedness with that person who had that experience, I am one and the same person. So again, on this first generic kind of view, it's psychological continuity and connectedness of some kind that guarantees my personal identity at that moment, in this moment. Even though the cells composing my brain and body have completely changed. So that's the first generic view. The second generic view takes personal identity to be interpreted in terms of something brutally physical. And on such views, you are and remain the being that you are in virtue of your functioning body, especially your brain on these views, or life-sustaining organs, especially your brain, or being the same biological organism or some other physical relation. The point is, regardless of psychological facts. So what makes you the same person has nothing to do with psychological continuity and connectedness. It has to do with something brutally physical. So let's discuss an example. So say that X gets into an accident at T1. I don't want to say a person because that would beg the question, right? So X gets into an accident at T1. Then at T2, unfortunately, X has undergone an accident and has become Y. And an ambulance takes Y to the hospital, but Y is in a vegetative state. Now, many people who support a brute physicalist view of personal identity claim that, well, we have an intuition that X and Y are one and the same person. X has certain psychological features at T1. Y has certain psychological features, at T2. Y lacks psychological features at T2. Yet we claim that X and Y are the same. Is there psychological continuity or connectedness in this case? No, because Y is in a vegetative state. So people use examples like this to reinforce the intuition that personal identity consists of something brutally physical about the entities that are involved. Okay. Now, before I move on to the third approach, just to preview the third approach is to think that persons don't exist at all. They're a kind of fantasy or illusion that we have. There is no such thing, strictly speaking, personal identity. I want to point out that proponents of these first two generic views, psychological continuity views and brute physicalist views, generally agree that these relations hold and involve substantial particulars of some kind. Now here I don't just mean traditional Aristotelian substances. I mean substantial particulars in a much more broad sense that would include souls, minds, bodies, organisms, four-dimensional person stages or space-time worms, bundles of perceptions, bundles of qualitative features or properties, and so on. So these substantial particulars are supposed to be existentially independent. That is, they're not supposed to depend on anything other than themselves for their existence. They're also supposed to be the kind of thing that can remain essentially the same through time and change. That is, they'll remain numerically the same through changes in their qualitative properties, or put differently in more Aristotelian terms, they'll remain essentially the same through changes in their qualitative features, right? So on the Aristotelian view, for example, I am an individual substance that has the property standing in this spatial location at this moment. I am one and the same substance when at a different moment I stand in this spatial location. I remain essentially the same. I've undergone accidental changes in my properties. This is precisely how an Aristotelian, at least a traditional Aristotelian, would understand my personal identity through time. Okay. Now, because I'm at the Center for Process Studies, you're probably aware of why I'm pointing this out to you, right? So in a really influential volume, Personal Identity by John Perry, which is supposed to introduce the very issue of personal identity to a general audience, I thought I'd just read one passage here where I think it's clear that this supposition comes into play. So Perry writes, baseball games are not things in the ordinary sense, but processes. And they break up easily into discrete events, most of which begin with a pitch and end with a noise from the umpire. But persons are not processes, and there's no one natural way to break up a person's life into discrete events. Now you might ask, what argument does Perry give for this view? There is no such argument. He doesn't provide an argument for this view. It's simply an assumption. This assumption that persons are not processes is common to both psychological continuity and brute physicalist views. Whitehead's view, obviously, is going to turn out to be different. He's going to think that processes are fundamental. Now, before we get there, I want to mention a third generic approach to personal identity, and that is one that discounts personal identity altogether. You might think of Buddhist views of personal identity in this sense. So on one kind of Buddhist view, and again, I'm taking an entire field of study, Buddhism, and just giving a kind of generic account, right? There's many differences between different Buddhist views on this. But just for today's purposes, it might be to our benefit to refer to objects, and especially each other, in terms of nouns that denote entities that are supposed to remain one and the same over time. Now, that might facilitate our everyday intentional project. It's a lot easier for me to say, do you need a piece of paper, rather than to give a precise characterization of that in process ontological or in Buddhist cosmological terms, right? But the claim of a certain school of Buddhism is that when the meditator meditates upon the nature of his or her experience, one directly intuits the truth of non-self. That is, that the sense of self is itself, so to speak, an illusion, and that although it might be relatively true that persons exist, and we can use relatively true language to interact about persons, ultimately speaking, there are not persons, and thus no such thing as personal identity. Also on the Buddhist picture, a person is going to turn out to be an amalgamation of 5 different skandhas, or aggregates, that is, dynamic processual forces. So this is something that I think Whitehead's picture and ancient Buddhist pictures have in common. And just to be a little pithy today, I actually think that they're compatible, at least in principle, once we understand that Whitehead is engaged in speculative metaphysics. And I'll try to come back to that by the end. Okay. Are there any questions before I proceed onward? Okay, please feel free to interrupt me at any moment. Yes?
Under your second generic personality theory, would you include animalism? Because I
Yes.
heard Parfit was here just within the last year, and he was attacking animalism.
Yes, animalism. Olson is the most famous defender of this view, yes. And actually, this brute physicalist view fell out of fashion for centuries, actually, in the philosophical literature. Olson has revived it with this animalist view. Yeah, thank you. Okay, now let's move on to Whitehead's view and see how this fits with our intuitions. Now, Whitehead's approach doesn't fit neatly into any of the generic categories that I just adumbrated for you, although it has certain affinities with each of them. The reason, not surprisingly, is that his approach is process ontological. That is to say, Whitehead takes processes to be fundamental and so-called substances or things to be derivative. He defends the idea that processes, in fact, are fundamental, things that appear to us to be things. Let me rephrase that. Entities that appear to us to be things are, in fact, amalgamations of processes, in particular societies that unfold after time. But here you might wonder at the outset, okay, if Whitehead's approach is process ontological and he believes that processes are more fundamental than, say, substantial particulars, then reality is essentially dynamic in its nature. If reality is essentially dynamic in its nature, then it's only derivatively stable. But if reality is only derivatively stable and personal identity involves stability, You might think that we've lost all grounds for trying to explain adequately personal identity on the process ontological picture. The reason is, don't we need something that's more stable than mere stability among flux to adequately explain personal identity? In response to this challenge, Whitehead introduced a theory of personal identity early in his career, which I'm going to refer to as the inheritance theory, or equivalently, the inheritance model of personal identity. And my principal thesis with respect to Whitehead's theory is going to be twofold. The first is that Whitehead, in fact, has two theories of personal identity, and it's in 1931 that he introduces a second theory, which I'm going to refer to as a receptacle theory of personal identity. I'm also going to go on to claim that initial problems that he identified with the inheritance model of personal identity are in fact not problems for that model. Put differently, for folks familiar with Whitehead, the categorical scheme presented in processor reality is already adequate to explain the inescapable fact of personal identity. The introduction of Timaean receptacles in Adventures of Ideas is extraneous, ad hoc, and unnecessary. And this historical claim invokes a second systematic claim. He was right to jettison the receptacle theory. The inheritance model is actually much more promising than Whitehead himself at times thought. So this is the third section now, just a general introduction to Whitehead's metaphysics. And here I think I can be pretty quick. So on Whitehead's picture, he uses the terms actual entity and actual occasion synonymously to refer to the basic elements of temporal reality. He thinks that these are the things that are ultimately real, and that when we perform any philosophical analysis, that ultimately will ground out in actual entities. Now, an actual entity and actual occasion is a fundamentally dynamic item. That is, it is literally a becoming. It is literally a synthesis of things that have become before. But those syntheses or those becomings have to happen in a certain way. That is to say, they have to become in accordance with some pattern or shape. So if you take any actual occasion of experience, in his technical sense, that's going to involve both physical prehensions of both the positive and negative type, in addition to conceptual prehensions of both the positive and negative type. For that occasion, for example, ostensibly your experience now, there's a kind of unity to your experience that is possible in virtue of a shape that your experience takes, right? So for example, if you're, I hope not, but if you're thirsty at the moment, then your preoccupation with or your desire for having a sip of water might predominate in your current experience. That would be part of the effective tone or shape of your experience. There are also more abstract constraints, like an entity cannot have incompatible properties. Those would pertain to more objective features specified by eternal objects. But what I'm trying to emphasize here is a distinction on the one hand between actual occasions, which are the basic elements of temporal reality, according to Whitehead, and eternal objects, which are the fundamental elements of atemporal reality, according to Whitehead. Now, like Aristotle, Whitehead thinks that eternal objects, contra Plato, don't have independent existence. They ingress into actual occasions. So for that reason, there's a kind of privilege that actual occasions have vis-a-vis eternal objects, but they always come together from his point of view. Okay. Now, actual entities as basic units of reality often compose more complex units. In particular, they compose societies. I'm introducing this because it's going to turn out on his view that persons, living human persons, are societies. There's a specific kind of society. I'll save sort of technical details for discussion if we'd like to go into that. But the general category of a society is something that is self-sustaining, persists, and has a history. Now for Whitehead, that's going to include everything from electrons to nebulae, right? As long as there is some ordering of occasions that is self-sustaining and has a history over time, that complex is going to count as a society in his technical sense. Now here, I need to underline a difference. Actual occasions, Whitehead tells us, when an actual occasion comes into existence, it puffs in and immediately out of existence. They perpetually perish, as he puts it, drawing from Locke. A society differs. A society is a complex of actual occasions, but you can see the challenge now. If an actual occasion is something that puffs into and out of existence, and a society is supposed to be a serially ordered string of such occasions, then how can puffing in and puffing out explain personal identity? It seems discontinuous. It seems like, in particular, we can't explain diachronic continuity or diachronic unity. So that's the worry here. Okay. Now, to address this worry, we have the inheritance model. Okay. What makes diachronic continuity and diachronic unity possible on the inheritance model is a human person's subjective forms. Subjective forms consist of things like I've already mentioned when I described potentially being thirsty during the talk. Emotions, intentions, volitions, dispositions, tendencies, belief, and so on. That is anything that gives shape to our experience, any kind of pattern that our experiences can take. So for example, in the present moment, your experience of hearing this sound has a kind of unity to it. In particular, it has a kind of synchronic unity to it. Built into that very experience is that it was your hearing of the sound at that particular moment, despite the fact that so many actual occasions have become since then. It's in virtue of the subjective forms that underlie your experience that kind of synchronic unity is possible, right? There's something it's like to have the present experience that you have in that occasion. Subjective forms also make diachronic continuity possible. That is, even as I'm uttering this sentence, there are multiple actual occasions that are becoming in both my experience and your experience over time. And that experience has a kind of continuity to it. That is to say, when I utter a sentence, it's possible for me to mean something by it, and it's possible for you to understand something by it. So there's at least that continuity as a part of your experience. The continuity obviously is going to involve certain values and other things that you bring to the table, literally and figuratively, as it were. Okay. So subjective forms, I've said, make synchronic unity possible. They make diachronic continuity possible. They also make, on the inheritance model, diachronic unity possible. So the experiences that you have as time unfolds belong immediately to your life. There's not a sense in which you have to decide to make your present experiences belong to your life. They present themselves immediately as being constituent parts of that one whole life, and thus are unified in that respect. That's possible on the inheritance model in terms of subjective forms. Now I want to flag that because this is the diachronic unity issue is ultimately what Whitehead's going to be concerned about and introduce a new model of personal identity to try to explain diachronic unity. He ends up thinking in 1931 that subjective forms on their own aren't sufficient for diachronic unity. They can get you synchronic unity, they can get you diachronic continuity, they can't get you diachronic unity, he thought, for a few years at least. And then I think he changed his mind. Okay. All right, so here's a potential problem with the inheritance model. Whitehead thinks that any actual occasion, any becoming, is absolutely individual and unique. And he has a doctrine that expresses this general metaphysical thesis, and that is the doctrine of novelty. Although there are close connections between your present experience at this moment and this moment, strictly speaking, they're numerically distinct. Strictly speaking, those are different entities altogether. They're connected in certain ways, but they're different altogether. Now, that doctrine of novelty doesn't apply only to actual occasions of a society. It also applies to subjective forms. So the subjective form underlying your experience at this moment and the subjective form underlying your experience at this moment, strictly speaking, according to Whitehead, are numerically distinct. There has to be something different in the pattern of those two becomings. Now, in light of that view, there's a concern. How can a serially ordered set of person occasions be diachronically continuous, and more importantly, diachronically unified? The worry is that the patterns of those becomings are numerically distinct. And if the underlying forms aren't identical, how can the person be identical? It seems like the same subjective form has to underlie the occasions of a series, otherwise that series won't be diachronically unified. Okay. Now I think Whitehead on the inheritance model has an answer to this potential problem too, and I think it involves two interdependent claims. Now, because Mr. Cobb is in the room, I feel like I should flag the fact that in his book of 1965, Natural Christian Theology, he has a slightly different interpretation of this issue. So I'd be happy to review this.
I'm not the same person who wrote that book.
Indeed. And this will go on to support my view. Okay, so I think in response to this challenge about the partial identity of subjective forms, the inheritance model advances two claims. The first is that occasions of the person type inherit and transmit common patterns or defining characteristics to their immediate successors. And these recurring elements can be said with qualification to remain the same over time. Whitehead discusses an example of a man who's angry. It's part of the whole subjective form of his experience at one moment that he is angry. And that form transmits itself to the next occasion, which still includes this man's disposition, what we refer to as this man's disposition to stay angry. So the disposition of being angry remains the same between the two occasions, even if other parts of the whole subjective form change between those two moments. Now, the second claim of the inheritance model is that such patterns or characteristics are inherited and transmitted in specific ways, depending on the contexts or actual worlds of the pertinent occasions. So what I'm saying here is that inheritance and transmission of elements of subjective forms is contextually sensitive. It doesn't have to happen only one way. So sometimes memory might be most relevant to the becoming of the present occasion. For example, when I remember driving to Claremont this morning and thankfully not encountering any traffic, right? Memory is the relevant part of the subjective form that makes this experience part of the same life as what occurred earlier, right? That's the mode of inheritance that's relevant to that maintenance of personal identity across these distinct occasions. But other times memory might be completely irrelevant. Is anyone familiar with Clive Wearing?
I'm sorry, with?
With Clive Wearing? Clive Wearing is a person who was an extremely accomplished musician and ended up undergoing damage to his hippocampi, which profoundly affected his ability both to remember things from his past and to form new memories. So it's said that Clive Wearing lives in an eternal present. There's a documentary about Clive Wearing, and during one part of the documentary, they have his wife come into the room for 10 seconds, and then she will exit the room, and then she will come back into the room, and she does this maybe 6 times. Each time she walks into the room, Clive Wearing lights up and he says, Linda, I've not seen you in forever. I've just become conscious for the first time. And he's absolutely elated to see her. And this happens 6 times in a row. So what I would want to claim in an example like that is it's not memory. I do think Clive Wearing remains the same person, but I don't think it's memory in virtue of which he remains the same person. Rather, I think it's in virtue of the love that he sustains for his wife that makes him one and the same person. And we could discuss other examples, but again, what I want to emphasize here is that for Clive Wearing, love is what sustains him, the person. Literally, it's what sustains him. And on other occasions, it might be memory or intention, value, and so on. Please.
You said to jump in at any time.
Please, yeah.
I really like what you're saying here, but he remembers who his wife is.
Does he remember who his wife is?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Otherwise, so there is some kind of continuity there, isn't
Yes, absolutely. I do think there's continuity. I also think that there's a kind of unity that's at play too. It's just that the continuity and the unity are explained not by one specific sort of subjective formal feature. It can be different for different people, different at different moments. Because some people have argued that on Whitehead's model, memory is the primary part of the subjective form. And how I'm interpreting his inheritance model is that it doesn't have to be memory, it could be other forms, so to speak, other parts of the subjective forms, like in the case of Clive Wearing, love. That's what the example is meant to help illustrate.
Would you mind writing the name of that person that you
Yes.
mentioned, Clyde?
Absolutely, and if at least a few months ago, the entire documentary was available for free on YouTube. I mean, it's incredibly powerful. I cried my eyes out during that part. Yeah, Clyde.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. There's a related case too with a patient who's known in cognitive neuroscience literature as HM, where the situation is a bit similar with this. There's more written on him, but it's quite a thing to see this Clive Wearing in person, as it were. Okay. Now, I find some historical evidence for this if you take a look at your handout. So even in lectures of 1927 that were delivered before the lectures that became Processing Reality, Whitehead described personal identity in terms of partial identity of form or genetic identity of form, not strict numerical identity of form. This is the first quotation on the handout. The human person in one occasion of his experience, quote, is the most concrete actual entity, and the life of human from birth to death is a historic route of such occasions. These concrete moments are bound together into one society by a partial identity of form and by the peculiar, I can never say this word, I couldn't say it at the APA, I can't say it now, but you know how to pronounce it. Full summation of its predecessors, which each moment of the life history gathers into itself. So the emphasis already at this relatively early point is on partial identity of form and not strict identity of form. And one more qualification about the inheritance model. The fact that specific elements recur in successive subjective forms doesn't limit the novelty of what can become. So you might think that, okay, Whitehead, if you want to explain personal identity in terms of partial identity form and recurring elements in the subjective forms, doesn't that limit the kind of novelty that you want to attribute to experiments in general? And I would argue that actually these are not in conflict whatsoever. It's rather that subjective forms are the kinds of things that make novelty possible. So it so happens that I have a set of moral, ethical, and political values at this moment. I also had a set of moral, political, religious, and other values when I was 8 years old, and thank goodness that those have changed. So rather than constraining what can become, I think a more appropriate metaphor is that a subjective form makes possible novelty in becoming, whether that's at the relatively superficial or deep level, and that'll depend on, again, the context and where a person is, so to speak, in his or her existence. Okay. Now, here's the problem that Whitehead for a while thought undermined the inheritance model. Doesn't it just beg the question? Doesn't it presuppose without showing that actual occasions with distinct subjective forms are diachronically unified? Again, the word pertains to diachronic unity, not diachronic continuity, but specifically diachronic unity. Why would continuities of subjective elements ipso facto entail diachronic unity? In virtue of what are such commonalities parts of one and the same whole life? These recurrent elements in the subjective forms, those that underlie serially ordered person occasions, they might be necessary for synchronic unity and diachronic continuity. but they're not jointly sufficient for personal identity, one might think. The reason being that on their own, subjective forms are incapable of unifying unique experiences into one whole life. Why should we think that subjective forms make diachronic unity possible? This is the worry. This is the concern. Or so one might think. And it's in response to this concern that we get Whitehead's receptacle theory. So in 1931, when he gave a lecture, this would become his book, Adventures of Ideas. Here's how he articulates the worry. This is the second quotation on the handout. In our account of human experience, we have attenuated human personality into a genetic relation between occasions of human experience. He uses the word attenuated pejoratively. Yet personal unity is an inescapable fact. Evidently, there's a fact to be accounted for. Any philosophy must provide some doctrine of personal identity. In some sense, there is a unity in the life of each human from birth to death. So he thinks that the inheritance model has attenuated personal identity. That is, put differently, he doesn't think that he has adequately, in his technical sense, explained the inescapable fact of personal identity. So his solution is to adapt a passage that he appropriates directly from Plato's Timaeus. In Plato's Timaeus, Timaeus starts out by giving a vast, impressive cosmology that postulates only two fundamental categories, that of being and that of becoming. Timaeus being a Platonist, if I may, privileges being over becoming, but he thinks that he can explain the entirety of reality with only these two categories. The dialogue goes on for about 20 pages, and Timaeus ultimately stops and says, actually, this model is less likely than another model. We need a model that has the categories of being, becoming, and a receptacle that makes the becoming of beings possible. Now, the way to understand this receptacle, it's exceedingly abstract, and Timaeus himself says that we can only apprehend this receptacle with a kind of bastard reasoning. So I try to understand it in the following way. For those who have read Wittgenstein's Tractatus, it's something like logical space, something like absolute space. It's not a physical space, it's that in virtue of which anything can become spatially whatsoever. In Timaeus, we get the metaphor of a perfume maker who, in order to make perfume, has to have a liquid that has none of the qualities that the other liquids will give to it, such that the perfume can smell in the way that it does. The odorless liquid is the lowercase r receptacle of the perfume. The capital R receptacle is that which makes possible any being that becomes, the becoming of any being. And so now let's read the third passage. And Whitehead is quoting verbatim Plato's Timaeus while inserting at certain points his own technical terms. I haven't done that. Whitehead himself is doing that. And he says about this passage that, quote, it is impossible to improve upon, end quote. Which ostensibly is why he just quotes it verbatim and inserts his own technical terms. So he writes, following Plato, in addition to the notions of the welter of events and the forms which they illustrate, we require a third term, personal unity. It is a perplexed and obscure concept. We must conceive it as the receptacle, the foster mother, as I might say, of the becomings of our occasions of experience. This personal identity is the thing which receives all occasions of the man's, or he should say, human's existence. Okay. So here's, in a nutshell, how this thing is supposed to work. Each of us, as a person, has a receptacle with a lowercase r. And this receptacle is supposed to be formless. And I want to underscore that because on the inheritance model, as we talked about, it's the subjective forms that make personal identity possible, whereas on the receptacle model now, it's a formless receptacle that makes personal identity possible. Your formless receptacle, each of our formless receptacles, is supposed to be that abstract structure in virtue of which any experience you have is immediately your experience. So He refers to this as the foster mother of becoming, or the wet nurse of becoming. The idea, right now, the description of bastard reasoning takes on a different meaning, right? The receptacle is supposed to welcome into itself anything whatsoever that becomes without imposing any constraints whatsoever on it. So again, it's like that odorless liquid that merely accepts any odored liquid that comes into it. Now, it's precisely in being formless that the receptacle is supposed to ground and actually be, as he says in that passage, personal unity or personal identity. Whatever happens in the train of your experience, it's part of your whole life, regardless of your values, regardless of how your values might shift over time. So this, in short, is how Whitehead thinks he gets personal unity. More specifically, diachronic unity. It's in virtue of your receptacle, and we each are supposed to have one. In particular, he takes himself to have obviated that aforementioned objection, the objection that subjective forms could only get you synchronic unity and diachronic continuity, but not diachronic unity. Okay. Therewith, the inheritance model's attenuation of human personality is supposed to be solved. Okay. Now, I don't know about you, but you might be scratching your head and asking, wait, what is this receptacle? Okay, so I have I think at least three objections should be raised against this general notion of the receptacle. The first being that it's mysterious what the hell this thing is, right? Now, it being mysterious on its own is not an objection, right? And indeed, for those who have read Whitehead, the philosophy of organism is quite mysterious, at least at first glance, when one reads the philosophy, right? That said, the mysteriousness of formless receptacles, it pressures Whitehead to provide some reason other than sheer convenience for why we should believe specifically in such a thing. Now, unfortunately, in Adventures of Ideas, which is where the only place where this makes an entrance, he provides no such reason. Now, this brings me to my second criticism, and that it's ad hoc. Right? Receptacles explain diachronic unity and personal unity by fiat. Again, I think that Whitehead is merely begging the question here. He's employing a form of bastard reasoning that is bastard in the sense that it doesn't provide an argument for why we ought to believe in this as opposed to some other model, namely his inheritance model, which he had already introduced at that point. Now, even if we interpret Whitehead's methodology as being charitably as being abductive, that is to say, making an inference to the best explanation, it's still not clear why the receptacle theory is supposed to be better than the inheritance theory. He's merely stipulated that this is the abstract structure that makes all of your experiences unified within one and the same life. Now, the third and most devastating objection to my mind is that what he took to undermine the adequacy of his inheritance model actually doesn't underline that model. I think that the categorical scheme presented in Process and Reality already gives him the conceptual resources and ontological resources he needs to explain diachronic unity, which is the principal issue. Okay. Now, I think that there are two interrelated explanations of this fact. The first is systemic and the second is historical. And the first reason being systemic is a bit more technical. The key insight systemically is that the relations that obtain between successive subjective forms, given their recurring elements from moment to moment, is itself inexorably dynamic. It's not something that happens for an instant statically and goes out of existence. Rather, the relation between subjective forms is itself dynamic. And in that way, I think they ontologically ground the inescapable fact of personal unity. Whitehead takes personal unity or diachronic unity to be the ultimate referent of the phrase personal identity. Now, why is that? Again, the nature of human personal ordering, as Whitehead conceives of it, entails that each occasion's subjective form, it contributes to the pattern of its immediate successor. It's in the very nature of a subjective form to contribute elements of its pattern to its immediately following successor, and it does that, moreover, in an essentially dynamic way. And I think that these dynamic, temporally continuous relations both establish and maintain the unity of that series. That, I think, on its own is sufficient to explain diachronic unity. So let me just take an example. How am I doing on time, by the way?
You're fine.
Okay, I'm nearly finished. But just to take an example, the present experience of gratitude that I feel for you all showing up late on a Wednesday evening to hear about a relatively abstruse topic in Whitehead's philosophy that has some relevance to your own self-understanding, depending on whether you totally disagree with it or not. That sense of gratitude, now that I mention it and become aware of it, becomes amplified in the present actual occasion of my experience. So this increasing sense of gratitude that I want to communicate to you and I hope is communicated becomes amplified throughout this series. Now, as I experience that gratitude, it presents itself inextricably as mine, essentially as mine. That's built into the very experience itself. So the question of unity is a conceptual question, but when I have direct insight to the very structure of my experience, diachronic unity is built in. The conceptual point I'm trying to make for Whitehead's philosophy is that subjective forms, it's in virtue of those that diachronic unity is built into the immediacy of my experience and my intuition of the present moment. So, in short, thank you for being here. Okay. Now, I've just provided you with a systematic reason why the worry that Whitehead had about the inheritance theory actually isn't a concern that undermines the model. I also think there's some historical evidence for this fact. So, brief trajectory. In 1925, we have Science in the Modern World. In 1927, we have Symbolism, Its Meaning and Effect. And then Whitehead gives a lecture series in 1927 to 1928 that becomes Process and Reality in 1929. This is his magnum opus. It's specifically in a lecture that he delivered in 1931 where he first introduces the notion of a receptacle. These lectures ultimately become, in part, adventures of ideas. Now, after this, after 1933, there's no mention in his writings of a receptacle, lowercase r or capital R. And in fact, I want to claim he returns to the inheritance model, and for good reason. The inheritance model wasn't in trouble on diachronic unity. So take, for example, quotation number 4 here. This is from Modes of Thought, which is based on lectures of 1937. And there he writes, how can the unchanging unity of fact generate the delusion of change? Surely the satisfactory answer must embody an understanding of the interweaving of change and permanence, each required by the other. This interweaving is a primary fact of experience. It is at the base of our concepts of personal identity, of social identity, and of all sociological functionings. Now, in this passage, Whitehead mentions interweaving. And I think the interweaving to which he refers in this passage is meant to connote the category of the ultimate that he mentions in Process and Reality, that is concrescence or becoming, process. You might think of this as ontological becoming. He also refers to this as prehension or transmission. Prehension is abstract, according to Whitehead. That is, in the kind of contemporary sense, That is to say, it's neither spatial nor temporal. Ontological becoming is atemporal, in fact, according to Whitehead. This is what he learns from Zeno's paradox, his interpretation of Zeno's paradox. So it's abstract, and it's also discontinuous, and it's distinct from categories of existence, that is, actual occasions and eternal objects. And I think that this means that the category of the ultimate is well suited to play the role of marrying activity and value, that is, forming matter. In other words, of the interweaving of actual entities and eternal objects that he describes. Therefore, receptacles are not needed. The thesis that prehension enables forms to ingress in actual matters of fact occasions exactly enough. Now, fittingly, in Whitehead's final written words on the matter, this is from 1941, in a lecture titled Immortality, he talks about activity and value, again with no mention of receptacles when discussing personal identity. This is the final quotation on the page. Each single example of personal identity is a special mode of coordination of the ideal world into a limited role of effectiveness. The maintenance of character is the way in which the finitude of the actual world embraces the infinitude of possibility. In each personality, the large infinitude of possibility enters into the finite actuality. Also, this entrance is more or less. There are grades of dominance and grades of recessiveness. So when I hear him talk about grades of dominance and grades of recessiveness, this is closely related to what I was trying to emphasize before about the context sensitivity of personal identity. The fact that in certain contexts, certain recurring elements of subjective forms are simply more relevant than others, whether that's memory, in certain instances, intentions, emotions like love in the Clive Marion case, and so on. And I take this passage and others to indicate the extraneousness of postulating receptacles to explain personal unity and our sense thereof. Okay. I'll just mention in passing, maybe we can go through this in the Q&A. I think a similar kind of argument would apply to the capital R receptacle that Whitehead introduces in Adventures of Ideas. Similar to Timaeus, he thinks that he has to introduce a capital R receptacle to explain how everything that becomes is part of one and the same universe. The capital R receptacle is supposed to be the foster mother of all becoming on this view. And again, I think that's an extraneous theoretical postulate that he doesn't need. He doesn't need it because he has the category of the ultimate. That does the work on this point. So in conclusion, one advantage of interpreting Whitehead in the way that I've suggested is that it explains why he introduced receptacles and the receptacle, capital R, in 1931, yet never explicated precisely how they were supposed to accord with the categorical scheme introduced in Process and Reality. The fact that a thinker of Whitehead's caliber never detailed these issues, moreover, in concert with his omission of receptacles and the receptacles in later writings, suggests that he abandoned the notion altogether. Introducing receptacles was an adventure of ideas that discorded radically with previous ventures. The identity of Whitehead's system, as it were, could not be maintained on such an extraneous, if adventurous, assumption. Thank you.
We have 25 minutes for comments, questions, concerns.
If no one else wants to, I'll tackle it. Chris, I'm so grateful to you for sort of justifying the fact that I've always skipped that passage. I haven't known what to do with it. I didn't feel like I needed it, and so now I feel like, okay, I've got some support in doing what I've always felt a little guilty about. Okay, so thank you. I still have less comfort in leaving matters as you have left them. I'm not discussing what Whitehead says. I'm just discussing the issue of personal identity. Sure. And I have worked on it, not in the book that you're referring to, but in other books, in a different way. And I'm just curious whether this makes sense to you. It seems to me the problem is we speak of inheritance, but my present experience is inheriting from a great many things. So the important thing is to distinguish how it inherits from one differently from all the others. Have you already answered that question? Okay, tell me then the answer to it.
I believe I have.
Okay.
Part of the, I'm going to express this in Whiteheadian. One of the recurring elements in subjective forms is consciousness. Consciousness already comes as individuated, and in particular comes with the capacity for self-consciousness. And so the consciousness of a particular self, one and the same self, undergoing the different occasions of experience in that series.
And so until you arrive at a stage that you could call self-consciousness, there's no personal identity then.
I think that's right.
And then when you are unconscious, you're not the same person.
For example, in sleep.
Well,
In some sleep.
I think there are, this dreamless sleep, yes.
I would claim that because there's still experience, there might not be experience of the person directly.
There's
But
not
there's-
self-consciousness, though, in all dreamless sleep, do you think?
No,
No,
there's
okay.
not. I do think there's the potential for self-consciousness in the next moment.
And is the potential then what makes it the same person, or does it have to be actual?
I think it's the, yeah, that's tricky. Because now I'm thinking not only of cases of sleep, but for example, people in comas
Yes.
or vegetative states. So the question is potentiality on its own sufficient for personal identity?
And what, when you say there is
Yeah.
potential in a particular actual occasion, if you are suggesting that that actual occasion has potentials that other actual occasions don't have.
That's right. Based on what has become before, but let me, if I could take a step
But
back.
when you
because I
say
have a-
before, you mean before in the sequence of self-conscious occasions?
Potentially self-conscious occasions. So this relates to the kind of intuition that I have to respond more directly to your
Okay.
first question. I would say that I don't want to locate personal identity in actual occasions where one is self-conscious. I think the potentiality is crucially important there. But in a case like a vegetative state or even sound sleep, I think the potentiality in those cases is sufficient for personal identity, given that some new occasion doesn't become and thereby radically change the structure of the subjective forms that are involved. So if it were impossible, goodness forbid, if it were impossible, well, I guess it wouldn't matter, right? Because then I wouldn't exist anymore, so why would I be worried about it? If it were impossible for me to have any continuity whatsoever with previous experience, and when an actual occasion happened that was occasioned by this body, it were a radically new person. Up until that moment, it would still be the same person in virtue of the potentiality for self-consciousness and self-experience that underlie it. But I think something new would have to become. In particular, I think a new person would have to be to become to say that strictly speaking, that is no longer the same person. And in this way, I think it gives us a way to understand and process ontological terms one of the examples that I brought up in the talk that was supposed to support group physicalist views. That is, a person having certain psychological experiences at T1, lacking them at T2, and yet we refer to them as the same person. I don't think we have to adopt a group physicalist view to do that. I think if we preserve this notion of potential self-consciousness as the same self, precluding radical becomings in the future, that's a kind of way that Whiteheadian realities could address that challenge. I need to think more about this issue, though. That's an excellent question. Thank you.
I'll try out another explanation on you sometime.
Okay.
Can you say any more about how you would respond to John Perry? I know you've already done it, but he says persons are not processes, and you're saying they are, or Whitehead is.
I'm saying Whitehead is. I'm saying we shouldn't rule it out. There's so many problems with co-locations and constitution that come up in the metaphysics of personhood, but I don't think we even have to have determinate views about that. The problem I have with Perry is that the claim that persons are not processes is an assumption for which he and most other folks working in this field provide no argument. And I don't feel ready to claim that a process ontological account of personhood is superior to one that is not process ontological. I do incline in that direction. But What I would want to point out to Perry and others working in this field is we ought not to make fundamental philosophical and metaphysical assumptions of this kind. We shouldn't just take the metaphysics that can be easily read off of natural language to indicate the way that things are metaphysically. Now, incidentally, to make this a little bit more personal, I am a Buddhist and have meditated in ways that are supposed to, or designed to, I should say, reveal the nature of personhood and the ineluctable sense of non-self that comes up when one meditates in this way. Given that opens one up to the essentially dynamic and processual nature of reality, I'm inclined to think that process ontological views of personhood are to be preferred. But I suppose that Perry and other would just say, well, that's your experience and that's anecdotal. Why should we take that to generalize? In response, I would just say, fair enough, but why should we assume that persons are not processes? You need to provide me with an argument for that. And there hasn't been one provided, by Perry at least.
So again, instead of saying Perry's wrong and I'm right, you're saying let's think together beyond
Yes,
Perry.
yes, exactly. Please.
Did you say anything about life after death, or did I miss it?
I mentioned it as one of the issues that is pertinent to questions about personal identity. And this, I think, incidentally, is one of the things, as Mr. Cobb pointed out as early as 1965, that concerned Whitehead about his own theory. He took there to be a God, and he wanted to allow for the possibility of life after death. There's no reason from his perspective to rule this out. And he was worried that the inheritance model wouldn't enable him to explain that. I think properly understood, the inheritance model, and actually, strictly speaking, the receptacle model as well, both leave open the possibility of life after death. To say anything more determinate about it would put us epistemically on pretty shaky grounds, but I do think both models remain open to that possibility. Please.
I'm not familiar with what I'm going to ask you about too well, but back in the 30s, it seems there was a discussion between Whitehead and Edgar Sheffield Brightman on this. Brightman, the Boston personalist.
Okay.
Brightman tried to respond to Whitehead in a book that he never finished but was published called Process and Personality.
Okay.
And there's a really interesting exchange of letters between Hartshorne and Brightman that was published a few years ago.
Okay.
Brightman considered Whitehead to be an impersonalist.
An impersonalist?
Impersonalist, as opposed to, the personalist tradition that starts with Gordon Parker Brown and Brightman and Martin Luther King. The person is somehow the primary metaphysical category.
Oh, I see. I see.
But it might be interesting.
Yeah, I certainly will look into it. Let me just briefly register a kind of initial skepticism I have to that idea. Given how robust and flexible Whitehead's category of societies happens to be, it allows for, if I could invoke a kind of Weberian distinction between society and community. So Weberian society is a collective that is constituted by individuals, where individuals are the fundamental unit composing the society. So when we refer to as a society as having values, volitions, dispositions, and so on, that's determined by the individuals constituting that society. In contrast, we could talk about a community. And a community is one in which, in Weberian terms, the values, dispositions, tendencies of the collective take precedent over that of the individual. And I think Whitehead's categorical scheme, and in particular his flexible conception of what a society is, can explain both of those phenomena in really refined ways. So I would be hesitant to say that he's an impersonalist.
Yeah, you have to come from Boston personalism to say something like that, I think.
I have to come from.
That whole tradition, the Boston personalist group.
Oh, I see.
That's why they looked at him as a
Right.
personalist. They did Bergson as well.
Yeah, see, I would wonder if Whitehead, though coming from a particular perspective, Whitehead's cosmology is part of its explanatory power and impressiveness is that it could account for where they're coming from while also contextualizing it and saying, well, that's really only one kind of collective. In fact, the cosmology accounts for both kinds and even more kinds. But I will have to look that up. Thank you. Yeah. Please.
In your experience of Buddhist meditation,
Yeah.
Is there the experience of non-self? And how do you understand that in Whiteheadian terms? I'm wondering particularly the experience of a witness to processes of the mind as it's moving in a series of identity images.
Okay. Yeah, this is difficult. Let me try. So to some extent, I have to draw on my own personal experience is not the best way to describe it, but I have to draw on some kind of experience that I have had, right? I think this kind of meditational experience, which I have had, which is one of awareness of and experience of non-self, could be described in Whiteheadian terms. And I think the way in which I would imagine it going is that there would be certain features of the subjective forms that typically underlie persons' experiences, that in those rare moments are not present. So for example, the presence of tendencies and values. In that moment, there is, strictly speaking, a gap that occurs. Strictly speaking, in that kind of raw, direct experience of non-self, it doesn't occur in the present moment. It occurs in what Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche refers to as the fourth moment, where the first three moments are the past, the present, and the future. Truly, when one has insight of this kind, it takes place in a gap, something non-temporal. And interestingly enough, for Whitehead, ontological becoming is gappy, it's discontinuous. It has to be, according to him, in light of Zeno's paradox. So the way I would interpret this is, though a living human person we refer to as a society, it's part of the capacity of that society to, at certain moments, or perhaps gaps between moments, to experience sheer becoming as sheer becoming in absence of ego or self. And in such a moment, the subjective form would lack certain components that are almost always there for us. And this would kind of indicate the radicality of that kind of nibbanic consciousness, or that kind of experience that doesn't involve a self, but rather the experience of non-self. Incidentally, I should also mention that according to Buddhists, there's no way to adequately explain linguistically or conceptual such an experience. That said, Whitehead's model gives us a pretty refined way to try to describe it, as I've experienced it at least. Yeah, please.
I am monitoring the online community, so I have an online question for you.
Okay, this is a first.
So here's the question. If we have consciousness and identity after death, how might time interfere with things like occasions, continuity, stability? Any of those things come into play in or after death, consciousness, and self-perception of personal identity? So
In a moment, I'm gonna ask you to, if you wouldn't mind, read that question again, because it's a good one and it's complicated. So thank you, whoever you are out there in the ether. My sense is that about life after death, to kind of go back to what I was saying to you before, we're on such shaky epistemic territory that a Whiteheadian could only speculate about speculations at that point. But if you wouldn't mind reading that again.
okay, so the question is, if we have consciousness and identity after death, how might time interfere with things like occasions, continuity, stability, and any of those things come into play in an after death consciousness and self-perception of personal identity?
I hope I'm understanding the question correctly, but my intuition is to say that we talk about temporal unfolding and we talk about time as being the form of experience, but temporality for Whitehead is ontologically derivative. Temporal becoming happens only because ontological becoming is in place first. That is to say, logically, not temporally, right? And ontological becoming is discontinuous. For this reason, when actual occasions become, as I understand it, please correct me if I'm wrong, the becoming of an actual occasion actually, so to speak, establishes temporal relations. It's not that an actual entity becomes in time. An actual entity does not become in time. Now, serially ordered actual occasions are temporally continuous, and there is such a thing as temporal reality for Whitehead. But I don't see time posing a problem for the kind of society that might persist after the extinction, let's say, of the human body. I think it's completely open on Whitehead's system for something like a soul, a disembodied soul, let's say more specifically, to continue to become. And I would think that occasions of that necessarily in his system would take place would happen at distinct moments. But that becoming at distinct moments would presuppose something non-temporal, in virtue of which that temporal becoming was unfolding. So I don't see a difficulty for trying to understand life after death and trying to reconcile that with temporality in that way.
Awesome, thank you. She very much was very excited about your response.
Oh, good.
And this was her first time asking questions, so she was
Good for her.
Oh, wonderful. It was an excellent question. I hope she asks more of other people. Yeah. Yes.
Could I ask you about, the last,
Quotation?
well, it's the last quotation. So where Whitehead talks about the finitude of the actual world embraces the infinitude of possibility, and then the large infinitude of possibility enters into the finite actuality.
Yeah.
Now, does that give us language to point to something like the bundle theory? That see, in terms of question of immortality or not,
Yeah.
life after death or not, we point to the individual that just died. Well, they were here, now they're gone. That's the end. So again, instead of settling on that view, now they're gone, that's the end of it, it's the end of all of us, we say, but wait a minute, there's this infinitude of possibility. So instead of identifying with the actuality, consider the possibility that we should be identifying with the infinitude of possibility.
Yeah.
Can you do that or not?
I worry on Whitehead's view. You can't. And the reason is this. In this lecture, he uses this distinction between what he calls the world of activity and the world of value. And that is what he's referring to here when he distinguishes between the finitude of the actual world and the infinitude of possibility. But when he says embraces there, what he's indicating is that these two are inextricably interwoven and that they essentially and symmetrically depend on one another. So as a consequence of that, the seeming infinitude of possibility would be constrained by what has become. And so in that way, I do, on the one hand, I think what you're pointing out, and correct me if I'm wrong, this seems to me to be very much right. Our conception of what possibility is so constrained by the kind of experience that we have as living human persons that we want to be certain about the possibility of life after death. And we make judgments based on that, abstracted away from the kind of experiences that we have. And you want to say, it seems to me, well, we should embrace a wider sense of possibility than that. And maybe not be so concerned with having such determinate answers to such specific questions, given our finitude, our epistemic fallibility, moreover. But in terms of the limitless of impossibility, that I think cannot, on Whitehead's system, be taken on its own. The infinitude of possibility is only conceivable literally within any actual occasion. And that indicates that there's always going to be some sort of constraints on the infinitude of possibility.
Just to make it, try to make it simpler, I think some of the Asian spiritualities talk about the light, or differentiate between the light and the candle, or the light and the light bulb. So you maybe say, are you the light, or are you the light bulb? You know, the bulb breaks and that's the end of the bulb, but light continues. So I mean, it's just a metaphor for the infinitude and the finitude.
Yeah.
So your answer would be the same?
It would be. I'd have to hear more about the specific traditions that you have in mind, and we'd have to have a longer conversation.
I think it's Hindu.
Okay. My inclination is to say that, at least on Whitehead's system, that still the infinitude of possibility is an abstraction away from actual matters of fact. And absolutely, we ought to have a wider sense of possibility than that which we think is possible. In some sense, Whitehead's metaphysics, being a speculative philosophy, is meant to embrace these kinds of possibilities. That is, reality actually might have the structure described in Process and Reality, right? A speculative metaphysics. At the same time, I would want to hesitate to go as far as the infinitude of possibility per se, simply because the infinitude of possibilities always, as an abstraction, is always counterbalanced by the finitude of actuality. To put it in different terms, as long as I'm engaged in an adventure of ideas, there's a kind of infinitude of possibility associated with the primordial nature of God in Process and Reality. But that's only an abstraction and is always counterbalanced by the other pole, which is the consequent nature of God. That's constrained by what has actually become, and incidentally, the consequent nature of God in Process and Reality functions a lot like the receptacle is supposed to in Adventures of Ideas.
Time for one more question, comment? If not, then let's thank Dan Siakel. Thank you. Thank you all for coming and listening.